Qereqeretabua. You have the floor, ma'am.
I thank you, Honourable Speaker. I rise to add my voice in response to His Excellency's speech to open this new session of Parliament. I must say, Mr. Speaker, in all honesty, that it's hard to refer to His Excellency's speech as most gracious, seeing as most of us on this side of the House know that it was perhaps drafted in the same approach as the Honourable Prime Minister's eye-watering iPad remarks on that now viral interview in Glasgow with the Commonwealth Secretary-General, as we all saw on Sky News. However, at this time, Mr. Speaker, I pay tribute to the late brother of His Excellency the President, the late Turang Natui Maduata Ratu Aiyaz Sayed-Khaiyum, for the vital part that he played in the study and conservation efforts at the Great Sea Reef, or the Kaulebu, the third largest or the third longest continuous barrier reef in the world, and the Turanga Natui Maduata's traditional Ingolingoli. At the end of 2004, Mr. Speaker, during a 12-day survey of the reef undertaken by WWF Pacific and its partners, significant threats to the Great Sea Reef were identified, such as overfishing, poaching, poison fishing, sand dredging, and other development activities. And it also found a species of damselfish previously unknown to science, 12 threatened species, including 10 species of fish, green turtles, and spinner dolphins. And a couple of years later, in my capacity as the manager of the Vodafone ATH Fiji Foundation, which had helped to fund the survey, I had the great privilege, Mr. Speaker, of traveling to the chiefly village of Nanduri Maduata with the late Ratu Aiyaz Sayed-Khaiyum and representatives of WWF Pacific to traditionally pronounce a tavu to conserve this treasure and all that it meant and continues to mean for the people of Maduata, Lebu, Fiji, and indeed the planet. Mr. Speaker, there is now more than ever a need to ensure that resource owners are a key part of the sustainability journey. Just as much as they might need to learn the jargon when it comes to high-level dialogue and compliance, government, through inclusive consultation and action, needs to learn from resource owners because the emerging science keeps pointing back to traditional knowledge systems as a solid foundation for sustainability and disaster resilience. On the issue of traditional knowledge, Mr. Speaker, I note that the annual Attorney General's conference next month has dedicated a session on mapping traditional knowledge on the 11th of December. And unsurprisingly, there is only one Itoke expert speaking on it, and no perspectives from actual traditional knowledge holders. In fact, every ethnic community in our diverse melting pot of Fiji, whether Indo-Fijian, Rotuman, part European, Rambi Islander, Chinese, Tongan, Samoan, Solomon Island, Ni Vanuatu, possesses their own rich traditional knowledge and heritage. How is this then all cumulatively mapped and recorded nationally? The Fiji delegation has returned from COP26. The climate crisis, we all agree, is as big a challenge facing the global south as the COVID-19 and its emerging variants. But what we have not heard from government, Mr. Speaker, is how under Article 6 rules, now agreed to in Glasgow, credits from reductions of emissions from deforestation and desertification, or REDD+, are now not included in order to prevent double counting and to prevent the richer countries paying developing countries to do the work without making any serious efforts at cutting emissions in their own countries. The World Bank and others have been piloting REDD+ projects here on the strength that landowners and resource owners could acquire revenue from the sale of carbon credits. It has also echoed that in that rapidly adopted climate change bill. But NFP had warned repeatedly that embedding references to Article 6 in the law before the negotiations were finalized was unwise. So now, how does government intend to resolve this apparent conflict between its law that this side of the House opposed and the recent UNFCCC adopted resolution? How does the government hope to stand by its promises to compensate resource owners and those high hopes of the 7 million trees, or as we heard from the former Minister for Forestry, 30 million trees in 15 years? On the issue of loss and damage at COP26, Mr. Speaker, which NFP also warned about on the drafts of the climate change bill, what happened during the actual negotiations, I wonder? Did Fiji pull yet another negotiation faux pas by suggesting the setup of a lost and damaged financial facility through an ill-timed intervention that raised many eyebrows in almost all our developing country negotiation blocs, including the Alliance of Small Island States, G77, and China? Did the Fiji delegation, under the micromanagement of the proxy minister for climate change, not understand the basic tenets of negotiating processes, where initiatives are first discussed and endorsed by negotiating partners beforehand? More importantly, Mr. Speaker, what does this all mean for our people and their families? What does this mean for families who can no longer afford the burden of the constantly rising kerosene and cooking gas prices, which we all know is going to rise again tomorrow, and then have to resort to firewood such as mangroves to cook their meals? The government can talk about China's loans to Fiji or how much budget support the New Zealand government is giving the Fijian government. But what does that mean for people on the brink of homelessness because they are not able to pay their rent? What does this mean for tenants who get asked to vacate a flat only to see the same flat going for a higher rent later without any improvements? How does all this talk translate into helping people living with disabilities have dignity when the budget announcement earlier this year of a measly $100,000 for the Housing Assistance Program for people with disabilities means only 20 people will qualify for the $5,000 grant? Only 20 out of the thousands of people with disabilities in Fiji. The government will boast about how much money was put into some people's hands, and I will stress some people's hands. But my question to them, Mr. Speaker, is what about the sad state of affairs in the Ministry of Education? What about paying the teachers what they are owed? What about the teachers with decades of teaching experience who are now being cast aside like unwanted rags, told in writing a month before Christmas that their contracts will no longer be renewed? The cane farmers whose ancestors came to Fiji to grow what would eventually become this nation's biggest earner of foreign revenue, being forgotten in favor of perhaps a glitzier alternative. The instrument of their livelihoods, sugarcane mills, allowed to fall into disrepair, and what that means for their generations of blood, sweat and tears, literally. What of the job security of the staff of FRCS, EFL, Water Authority of Fiji, just to name a few, and the very survival of their families? Mr. Speaker, His Excellency said, we should not suffer the politics of pettiness and personalisation or exist in some perpetual state of political antagonism. Instead, he went on to say, we must see further than short-term political wins toward a long-term vision for the nation's progress, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, control has brought this country to the state it is in. Not COVID-19, not past governments, the two things that this regime conveniently blames for all our troubles, but control. And dictators control. A dictator is a political leader who possesses absolute power. A dictatorship is a state ruled by one dictator or a small clique. In my opinion, what Fiji needs right now, Mr. Speaker, is a wholesale change. And for this to happen, the change must start with who is running this country and how. Unfortunately, the reality is that as long as the Minister for Economy runs this country, the politics of pettiness and personalisation will continue to be a blight on our nation. And we will exist, Mr. Speaker, and we will exist.
Order.
And we will exist in a perpetual state of political antagonism, while the ordinary but hard-working people of our country continue to suffer. We need only look at the shameful way that the former CEO of the Fiji Bureau of Stats and the former Solicitor General were treated to confirm that the politics of pettiness and personalisation, as His Excellency put it, is alive and well in the Fiji First Party. Even at this moment, we still have no idea why the chair of the Electoral Commission suddenly resigned. And what has the PM, as the chair of the Constitutional Officers Commission, going to do about it? Did the Attorney General know about Mr. Chandra's alleged trust fund issues when he was appointed and then reappointed? If so, why did he allow the appointments? No amount of condescending bellowing from my colleague to my immediate left as they did yesterday, can hide the fact that this sends a worrying signal to the world and to investors that elections could be mere months away, but the Electoral Commission chair has stepped down under mysterious circumstances and only Mr. Saneem is worryingly running the show. International idea is quite right, therefore, as Honorable Prasad said before, to label Fiji as a weak democracy. The government, by using this politics of pettiness and politicization, of personalization, coupled with vindictiveness and spitefulness, tries to gag any opposition voices from around the country, from industry, from civil society, from civil servants, former Fiji Airways staff, even from their own MPs, as well as opposition MPs. The world still remembers MPs from this side being pressured to attend multiple CID police interviews during a sitting week, flouting all protocols of parliamentary privilege. Need I remind Fiji during this, the 6th day of the UN 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, how the ruling party, Fiji First, used their print media mouthpiece to drag a woman, a proud daughter of Natewa, the former Minister for Women, through the mud because she dared to stand up for what she believed in relation to Bill 17. This brazen politics of pettiness and personalization, as His Excellency put it, Mr. Speaker, should alert us all to the bottom of the barrel lows that this regime, nay, the Prime Minister and his boss, the Minister for Economy, will stoop to for their own political survival. Right after the Bainimarama coup of 2006, our now Honourable Prime Minister told the chiefs of Fiji to go and drink homebrew under the mango tree. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition, himself a High Chief, Naturang Natuidakau, mentioned this in his speech yesterday. How ironic then that the Prime Minister now needs some of these very chiefs for his party's political survival. Now with that in mind, Mr. Speaker, and in regards to the next elections, His Excellency said, and I quote, "Those who seek office must approach the campaign with compassion, with dignity and understanding. They must stay high by adhering to the 7 principles of ethical conduct, rather than go low by seeking votes at any cost," unquote. I sincerely hope, Honourable Speaker, that by that His Excellency means that he, as the holder of the highest office of the land, will not lower himself to the conduct of the Fiji First Party and go on the campaign trail for Fiji First like his predecessors before him. I hope His Excellency, as the former past president of the Fiji First Party, means that FFP will not abuse state resources during the campaign period under his watch. Because, Mr. Speaker, for the information of members of the public who are watching right now, I wish to explain a few things about the position of the President of the Republic of Fiji, whoever he or she may be. The 2013 Constitution of the Republic of Fiji, sections 81 to 83, outline the office of the President. Section 82 says, President acts on advice, and goes on to say, in the exercise of his or her powers and executive authority, the President acts only on the advice of Cabinet or a minister or some other body or authority prescribed by this Constitution for a particular purpose as the body or authority on whose advice the President acts in that case, unquote. So I wonder then, Mr. Speaker, if the 7 principles of ethical conduct will be expected equally of all parties contesting next year's polls, or of only the parties running against Fiji First. Only time will tell, but I hope that His Excellency's legacy at the end of his tenure, whenever that will be one where he upheld justice and righteousness, fairness and service to all our people in equal measure. On the environmental front, Mr. Speaker, we all know that this regime, what this regime preaches overseas and what they allow to be practiced home are as different as day and night. Just a 30-minute drive from Parliament House, Mr. Speaker, are communities living beside the tributaries of the Wainandoi River. Families in the area, those who settled there decades ago, and those newly arriving there and settling on either freehold or crown land, all depend on rainwater and the tributaries for water for bathing, cooking, washing during the dry months, because despite being 30 minutes away from Parliament House and despite pre-election promises, they are still without piped water to this day. And in the words of one of the residents who I visited only last Sunday, Mr. Speaker, I quote, "So much for COP26, which I assumed was about saving what is left of our pristine environment. What was once the best water source for all residents along this natural ecosystem has now been destroyed. We engaged, they, We engage the Environment Department, only to be advised that it comes under Mineral Resources. We call them, only to be advised it comes under the Ministry of Waterways. When we call them, we are then advised that it comes under Lands Department. The riverbanks are collapsing even without rain or flooding, unquote. Finally, Mr. Speaker, a stop work order was approved a week ago today. The extraction from the Waisulumbonu Creek has stopped for now, but the damage has already been done. Mr. Speaker, because at any one time there would have been up to 3 diggers working in the creek with 7 different trucks taking loads. The banks of the creek are damaged and weakened for about 350 meters downstream. Now, Wainandoi children often go to the creek to brush their teeth, wash clothes and bathe. And I would hate to think what would happen if a weakened bank were to suddenly collapse on a group of frolicking kids. Families from Suva to Navua often go to Wainandoi to enjoy what used to be the cool, clear creeks. But I am told that when the extraction was happening, you only had to stand on the Wainandoi River Bridge to see the amount of silt that was traveling downriver to the sea. Silt which would then settle on the reef surrounding Nangara Island, endangering the ecosystem and the livelihoods of the families who live there and who rely on the reef for their food. So much for all the hot air from our ocean's champion. I am sure that this sad tale, Mr. Speaker, I can't believe that the Minister for Environment and Waterways is saying drama queen. This is his department, that he should shut up and take care of it. And totally misogynistic. Huh. We were just talking about, the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, and a man is calling me a drama queen. Thank you. Now, I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, that this sad tale is being repeated right around the country. Mr. Speaker, and would go unchallenged if were not for environmentally minded, passionate citizens who see the huge disconnect between what this government says overseas and what they allow to happen right here at home. Despite all the laws that we have enacted, where are the PM's bold statements on these types of rogue elements, willfully desecrating the environment? When will they pay for their sins? I wish to put the other side of the House on notice right now, Mr. Speaker. The residents of Wainandoi, those that you promised pipe water to before the last 2 elections, are waiting patiently for you to go back to Wainandoi before the next elections. Now, once the global community has kicked off the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, the Pacific last week did a soft launch on the UN Human Rights Women Human Rights Defenders Report, which shared that women are subject to threats and online bullying when we stand up to defend human rights. We question why women especially get victimized for vocalizing violations, including environmental violations in their communities. Another example, I'm reliably told just yesterday that the mortuary freezer in Levuka Hospital is again not working properly, and a few women from the communities there have been victimized by officials in Levuka for raising their concerns after they were told to bring the funerals of their loved ones forward because the mortuary could not preserve the bodies properly. On Saturday night, Mr. Speaker, I attended a House of Chameleon organized Transgender Day of Remembrance to remember those of the rainbow community who have been murdered in Fiji and around the Pacific. And I would like to ask, on behalf of all victims and families of their loved ones, including those of the late Magnus and the late Lucky, if the authorities could please at least update their family members on the state of investigations to find their killers. In closing, Mr. Speaker, I mentioned control and I mentioned dictators. It is well known in the civil service, and indeed around the country, that the Minister for the Economy likes to control everything. This is how dictators behave. Dictators cannot give autonomy. They cannot allow for other leaders to grow because they think only they are the fountain of all wisdom and knowledge, and they fear this power being wrested from them. From the abhorrent way that Fiji Airways staff were treated in May last year, to the recent revolving door of permanent secretaries, to the unconstitutional sacking of the Solicitor General, these all have the Minister of Economy's fingerprints all over them. All, of course, with the other 2021 sackings I mentioned earlier. Mr. Speaker, everything rises and falls on leadership. And in the words of William Arthur Wood, leadership is based on inspiration, not domination, on cooperation and not intimidation. With that said, Mr. Speaker, I thank His Excellency for his address. Vinaka, sir.